Good evening again. As John has said, before I get started, I would also like to add my thanks to the staff that run the Air Force Historical Foundation, from Angela, who's there on top of everything every day, to Steve Newbolt, who's not able to join us for this one, but has been our treasurer and then has taken on several projects helping Dick, but primarily to Dick, who has driven most of the changes that we see and not just come up with the ideas, but found a way to get them done and execute them. So from John and I would like to add my thanks. Dick, thank you. One of the pleasures of being the chairman of the Air Force Historical Foundation is that I get to be there when we recognize people that I have great respect and admiration for. It's kind of fun to be able to make that happen and to be a part of it. And tonight is one of those nights. Since 1953, the Air Force Historical Foundation, established by the first Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, General Toohey Spots, has been dedicated to preserving the history and traditions of American air power and space history. We focused on the Air Force. Now that there's a Space Force, I had a conversation with Jay Raymond and said, look, we will continue to be the repository for your history up until the time you tell us not to be, and they haven't yet, and so we continue to work that. We have a space committee, and we're working on ways that we can kind of be the department of the Air Forces, Air Force Historical Foundation, but we certainly have focused on air power and space power, and the individuals whose lives and dreams have been devoted to flight in the service of our nation. It's been 70 years since our charter was established by the earliest aviation pioneers, and Robert, thank you for sharing some of the history of that with us today, and seeing the, those folks in video that, it can easily become old guys in books until you see that they were real people, that they, were learning how to talk to television cameras and where to look while they were doing it, and all the things that we go through. You can put yourself in the same position and say, wow, they were just regular people. And when Jay Raymond, when we recognized him for his leadership of the Space Force, we said, imagine if at the start of World War II, they had asked General Arnold not only to build the air power required to defeat Germany and Japan, but to go ahead and carve off a separate service at the same time, which is what the Space Force is trying to do now. They're trying to transition to becoming a warfighting force and counter China. At the same time, they're trying to build their traditions and everything that goes with an independent service. A tremendously hard task. Our Keystone Award is this award that goes for career accomplishments in history, because we are the Air Force Historical Foundation. And this award was created in 2007. The inaugural presentation was to Major General I.B. Holley as a tribute to his decades of assistance, support, and encouragement to military historians, and so the award is named after General I.B. Holley. And throughout the years, Major General Holley served as a visiting professor at the U.S. Military Academy. He taught many courses on military history, the history of technology, and similar subjects at Duke, beginning in 1947. Over the course of 6 decades, General Holley wrote numerous books, scholarly papers, reviews, critiques, and demonstrated professional interest in various historical subjects, including the American Highway Revolution, air weapons development and acquisition, and intellectual histories. Some of the notable winners of the I.B. Holley Award have been Dr. Richard P. Hallion, Colonel Walter J. Boyne, Dr. Alan Grutman, Herman S. Wolk, Brigadier General Alfred F. Hurley, and we'll save a lot of the full readings of Phil's accomplishments until the ceremony on Monday. Tonight, we make special time for Phil to talk, because when we do that ceremony on Monday, we're getting a whole lot done, and there's an air show and lots of parts of that, and we wanted to make sure that we all got a chance to hear from you. But we also want everybody to know about our organization and about how important this word is, and so we'll have a more full bio when we introduce Phil Monday night. But the short version is, USAF class of 1970, C-130 Command Instructor Pilot, USAF Academy Deputy Department Head, Professor of Strategy at the Naval War College, Dean of the School of Advanced Air Power Studies at SAS, which is where I got to study with him, a defense analyst for SIAC and Northrop Grumman. He's lectured worldwide and has published a dozen important books. and hundreds of articles covering air power theory, strategy, and biography. He's the quintessential model of what the I.B. Holley Award was designed to recognize, an individual who's made sustained, significant contributions to the documentation of air power history during a lifetime of service. And this award is a tribute to his decades of writing, teaching, assistance, support, and encouragement to military air power historians around the world. And so many of you may have a story about how Phil influenced your life, and if you want to tell it in the hospitality room tonight, we'll look forward to hearing it. Because I'm the chairman, I get to tell one now. And I heard Tim Fay telling Phil that as a student in his Air Force Academy history courses, that he actually learned how to write from getting papers back and forth from Phil. What I would say about Dean Meilinger during my time there in the 3rd class at the School for Advanced Air Power Studies was that he taught us how to think. And the way he did it was he created an environment where he encouraged us to have opinions and to not be afraid to share them as young majors in the Air Force, where you can kind of grow up where you just kind of wait and hear what somebody else said and say that back to them, and you move on to the next place. But he encouraged us to have our own opinions, but he didn't let us think that they were always right. We were encouraged to speak up. We were encouraged to apply logic and understand our argument and present a cogent argument behind our opinions, and to be prepared for a faculty, including him, that would take them apart if they had holes in them and show us where those holes were. And that was a great education for future Air Force leaders to learn that way. And Phil, one of the things that I took from that was, as an ACC commander, people would often bring me a slide that had a quote from the Chief of Staff or a quote from the Secretary of the Air Force and say, so here's what we're going to do. And I said, look, don't bring me any more of those. If we can't think of a better reason for why we're going to do this and because somebody else said it, we're wasting our time. Let's understand the argument. Let's understand what we're trying to do. Let's think through it and fight over it and argue about it and pick the right one, and then we'll get out and go ahead and do it. So Phil, you taught many of us how to think and how to rethink when we had something wrong, and how to deal with being called out for when we had something wrong in front of people and work through it in a respectful way. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce to you our latest winner of the I.B. Holley Award, Colonel Phillip S. Meilinger.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I appreciate that. It reminded me, though, when I was teaching at the Air Force Academy cadets, we used to have them over on Sunday afternoons, kind of give them a chance to escape from the dorm, live with a real family for an afternoon. It was good for them. My kids loved it. They thought that was kind of cool. But I remember one day in particular, Sunday afternoon, and there's 2 cadets talking to each other, and I honestly don't remember the context and what they were talking about. But I just remember one cadet turning to another and saying very decisively, "It's like my grandmother's fried chicken. It's not very good, but she can make a lot of it fast." I always thought that kind of applied to my writing, to tell you the truth. I was asked to reminisce a bit and say a few things that I may have learned or realized about the history business over the past 50 years. So I hesitate to pontificate, but I realize that there are certain things that I think I have learned, so I'm going to pass them on a little bit to you. First, I found very early in my career that the historical field is a very big one. It's like a huge hotel with 100 rooms, but not all the rooms are considered to be equal. Some are considered to be better than others. And what I learned very early on was that among historians, military historians were not considered to be as credible or as real or as important as, say, diplomatic historians or social historians, which irritated me, okay? Worse than that, among the pecking order among military historians, the air power historians were down at the bottom. That really irritated me. And I tried to figure out, why that was the case. And I realized that part of it was simply that air power was so new. It had only been around less than a century. And so it was difficult, therefore, for us to compete with people who could talk about hoplites and triremes and Spartans and the Persians and stuff like that, because we didn't have that much history. But also I realized part of it was that we didn't have a lot of first-rate air power historians to carry that flag for us. And the good news is, I'm happy to say all these years later, that people like you, people in this audience, have changed the dynamic. And we've got historians, air power historians now, who are in the first rank, that I think can sit with anyone, with any historian, any military historian, and I think that's pretty damned impressive. Second, and related to the first, and this is something John Farquhar reminded me of a little while ago, and I'm glad I had put it in my talk before that, was that official historians are not considered as important as real historians. The feeling being that official historians, if you work, you're being sponsored like by a service to write their story, that by definition you are somehow tainted, that you are somehow not telling the truth, that you're pulling your punches. I get that to an extent, I suppose, that there is a temptation to do that. But again, the good news is I have found that, especially in the Air Force history program, I don't see that. And in fact, those of you're here studying the Vietnam War, and so the historians of that war, the Air Force historians, people like Wayne Thompson and Darrell Whitcomb here in our audience, and Jack Slight and Frank Futrell, the things they wrote are as good as anything that has been written by anybody about the Vietnam War. So I think that's something to be very, very proud of. But this issue of, I guess, truth is the thing, because again, official historians are accused of not being truthful, I suppose. In fact, there are some professional journals, as you know, that won't even review on official history because they consider it tainted. It's not up to snuff. So truth is a big deal among our profession. And so I've thought about that a lot over the years, about what is important about the history profession, this idea of truth. And this came home to me, I suppose, about 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. A guy named Barnett wrote a book called Stolen Valor. And he was not a historian, but he was a vet. And what he did in this book was talk about a number of famous politicians, celebrities, athletes, businessmen who had purported to be veterans, who had served in combat. And he did a wonderful thing. Freedom of Information Act, he pulled all their records. And he found that most of them were frauds, that they had either not served at all in the military, or if they had served, they had been in Germany during the entire Vietnam War, and they'd never actually been in Vietnam. One person in particular that he outed hit me very specifically, because this individual was a historian at a major southeastern university. And he purported to be a Marine who had fought in Vietnam in special ops and had been in covert ops. He talked a great game. He was a historian, and so he knew all the names, all the dates, all the places, all the facts. He could talk a good game. In fact, he was so good that he was repeatedly invited down to Quantico, Marine Corps University, to talk to the Marines there and tell them about his experiences in Vietnam, and they ate it up. He got outed by this guy Barnett in Stolen Valor. His response? Obviously, the CIA has gotten to my documents and doctored them. And then kind of disappeared. I don't know if he was fired or if he quit, but he left. Last I heard, I think he was up in Montana as a forest ranger or something. I'm not sure. But the point is that that experience, I'm sure those of you who have been teachers in history have faced the relevancy issue. Why teach history? Why take history? What good is it? You know, what's it going to do for me? And I've always thought that what we can do, our claim to fame, if you will, is that we can tell you what really happened. That we've done the documents, we've done the research, we've talked to the people, we've been there, and we can tell you without fear or favor what actually happened. We can give you the truth. That to me is a big deal. And here this guy betrayed that. If you can't believe the most basic facts of his life, and by the way, it also turned out that he had never graduated from college. He had forged his transcripts. If you can't believe the most basic facts of his life, how can you believe anything he's written? And like I said, that to me, it was a shattering of innocence, I suppose, for me, because I realized that there were people in my profession who betrayed the very core of what I consider it to be our modus operandi, what we're supposed to be about. We're supposed to talk right without fear or favor, let the chips fall where they may. Granted, it's not easy necessarily to tell the truth, but it's the truth as we think it is. It was as we have discovered it. And here this guy betrayed that, so that really irritated me. All right, third, challenge conventional wisdom. Don't take anything for granted. All assertions should be questioned. There's a lot of books I'll read, and I'll see something I hadn't heard before, and I'll look at the footnotes. As good historians do, always check the footnotes. And I'll notice that it's usually a secondary source. All right, fine. And then I'll read some other books, and pretty soon you get to realize that they all seem to be quoting each other, and they all seem to be citing the same secondary resource way back when. Dig deeper. Get to the bottom of it. Go look at the real documents, the original documents, and see what really happened. I'll give you two examples from my career that really kind of resonated with me. The first one was, the conventional wisdom says the Air Corps between the wars was populated by a bunch of loudmouth agitators who were always unhappy and always pushing for more money, more planes, more power, more whatever. When in reality, the argument goes, they really had it pretty good. But these crybaby aviators just wouldn't keep their mouths shut. So, what's the truth? Well, go back to the numbers. How about that? And so what I found, for example, there's back then there was a publication every year. The Secretary of War had to submit a report to Congress and the President. And in that report it was just lots of numbers. So, unimpeachable numbers. The Secretary of War knows how much money he spends. He knows who he spends it on and what he spends it on. He knows how many people, personnel-wise, are on the books. And he knows where they're located and what job they're in and whatnot. And so I looked at the numbers. And what I found was, astonishingly to me, was that and I crunched all the numbers. So I crunched all the numbers from 1919 to 1939, and the Air Service/Air Corps received, on average, 11.9% of the Army budget. Less than 12%. Is that really a good deal? Is that a favored child? And that's not the DOD budget. That's the Army budget. If you include the Navy numbers, it means that the air power in this country during the interwar years was getting around 10% of the defense budget. That does sound to me kind of low. And then I looked at the manning, about how well manned these crybaby aviators were. And you crunch the numbers, and 81% of the Air Corps was manned on average at 81% of its authorized strength. That was the lowest manning of any combat branch in the Army. The cavalry and the Signal Corps had a higher manning level than did the Air Corps. Promotions. As late as 1939, there's not one single permanent general officer in the entire Air Corps. Not one. The position, the stars, went with the position. If you left the position, you lost the stars. That is fertile ground for mischief. And a classic example of that is Major General Frank Andrews. Frank Andrews is, and by the way, I'll break to say that right now, Kathy Wilson just wrote a fantastic biography of Frank Andrews coming out next year. But anyway, Frank Andrews is Major General, and he's commander of the GHQ Air Force. 1939, Oscar Westover is killed in a plane crash. So he, as the senior guy, the senior airman, is called in by the Army Chief of Staff, Meilinger, to interview for the job, to take over as Chief of the Air Corps. And Craig asks him point blank, if I give you this job, will you stop agitating for more B-17s? And Andrews said no. He didn't get the job. Instead, he reverted to his permanent rank of colonel and was sent down to become the air officer for the 8th Corps in San Antonio, Texas. That was the same position, the same office, and honest to God, the same desk that Billy Mitchell had been demoted in exile to over a decade earlier. The Army's message was not subtle. Speaking of B-17s, B-17 flew first in 1935, revolutionary weapon. The Army, which is dominated by ground zealots, refused to buy it. Instead, they bought B-18 Bolos. Why? Because they were cheaper. And also, they were useless. And so when the war breaks out, we've got a grand total of 25 B-17s in the entire Air Corps. 350 Bolos, which never saw combat because they were obsolete. So, once again, I look at those numbers and those facts, and it's not quite the story that one usually gets by looking at the Air Corps between the wars. Those numbers were always there, and that's the key. That's what the point I'm trying to make. The numbers were always there. All you had to do is look for them. The second example, supposing I were to ask you what you think is the American military tradition. Okay. I'm sure what you would probably say is that it means civilian control of the military, and that the military and the officer corps has no business getting involved in politics, right? When I was a junior officer, I was told that I shouldn't even vote because that would imply that I'm involved in politics, okay? Well, let me give you a hypothetical. Supposing you've got a very popular and powerful general who is the senior military man in the United States. Let's say someone like Colin Powell after Desert Storm. And the parties, both parties by the way, approached him about being a presidential candidate. He said no. But let's just suppose he said yes. And he decided to run for president. But he did so while he was still on active duty. He didn't resign. He went around the country in uniform giving political speeches. He lost the election, but rather than disappear, he simply went back to his office in the Pentagon and remained the chairman of the Joint Chiefs for the next 10 years. And in fact, and this is the key, nobody in the news media, nobody in the military, nobody in Congress, nobody in the American public thought there was anything unusual about that. In fact, 3 years later, a grateful Congress promotes him and gives him another star. Hypothetical. Ridiculous, you say. Absurd, you say. I'm setting you up. I'm not talking about Colin Powell. I'm talking about General Winfield Scott. General Winfield Scott is a commanding general of the United States Army who 4 times ran for president while on active duty. In 1848, he vies for the Whig nomination with his fellow colleague, Major General Zachary Taylor. Taylor wins the nomination and runs for president. He does not retire. He does not resign. He is the commanding general of the Southern Division. He runs for president and wins. 2 months later, he puts in his papers. 4 years later, Winfield Scott does get the nomination. He doesn't resign or retire. He runs for president while on active duty. He does go around the country in uniform giving political speeches. He loses. Does he disappear? No. He stays in Washington as the commanding general of the United States Army for the next 10 years. And in fact, in 1855, a grateful Congress who loves him, promotes him to lieutenant general, the first person to hold that rank since George Washington. What that tells me is maybe the American military tradition is not quite exactly what some people think it is. Those facts about these generals, oh, by the way, it's not an aberration, all right? He's not the only one, okay? Because that's 1852. 1864, the Democrat nominee for president is Major General George Brinton McClellan. And he runs against his commander-in-chief, Abraham Lincoln. He does not resign, he does not retire, he runs while on active duty. He loses, of course, then he retires. 4 years later, the commanding general of the United States Army, General U.S. Grant, the first general in American history, who's also, by the way, simultaneously serving as a Secretary of War, he runs for president. He wins. He then tenders his resignation to take effect on Inauguration Day. I guess he didn't want to miss a paycheck. Again, there's others. Winfield Scott Hancock is the Democrat nominee in 1880. He runs while on active duty, as do Nelson Miles, as does Leonard Wood, Admiral George Dewey. They all run for president while on active duty. Later, Generals MacArthur and Eisenhower, and they didn't like to admit this, they secretly met with Republican Party leaders to discuss their campaigns for the presidency as Republicans. They did it secretly, but they did it, all right? So once again, like I say, perhaps these facts which have always been there, how come we forgot them? Because we did. We forgot about these things. I sometimes think we ought to take what I call a Jeopardy approach to history. And by that I mean we never assert anything. Like the TV show, everything has to be in the form of a question. And so we ask, what were the budget numbers between the wars? What is the American military tradition? Is war really an act of policy? In what cultures is that true? In what cultures is that not true? So I think you need to do that I think. You have to be wary of those things. I'm also wary of what if history. It is fun and enjoyable to speculate on what if, for example, Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union 2 months earlier like he had originally planned. Would it have made a difference? What if the Air Force had been allowed to take down the North Vietnamese air defenses in 1964? Would it have made a difference? I don't know, but that's the point. To answer those questions intelligently, the devil is in the details, thousands of details. Hardly any of us know what those details are. I certainly wouldn't. So what we're actually doing with what if history is we are guessing, we're speculating, or we're giving our opinion. And that's ahistorical. It's not something we should do. Fourth, I have found that the old adage that brilliant tactics do not overcome a flawed strategy is absolutely correct. Again, I'm talking about Vietnam for this weekend here. And how true is that? That airmen, Marines, soldiers, sailors are extremely ingenious tactically because they have to be. That's how they're going to stay alive. But no matter how ingenious, how clever, how courageous they are, if the strategy which they're supposed to follow is fatally flawed, they're dead. And again, the Vietnam people, the Vietnam War can certainly attest to the truism of that adage in that war about a flawed strategy. The tactics for the airmen, specifically I'm talking about, was incomparable, but they never had a chance. Finally, I like the British system in the sense that the really great recent British military historians like Michael Howard and Alistair Horn, Max Hastings, John Keegan, they were not just military historians. They were very good military historians, but they weren't just military historians. They were defense analysts. They thought that history was one of many tools, but was one tool that could be used to shed light on current and future problems. Who better to do that, I think, than historians who have spent their life trying to learn the truth about certain events. And therefore, they should be, to me, the first persons asked when something is happening around the world that has military implications. Americans don't seem to do that, and sometimes I wonder if they should. Again, who's better to do it than you people, is the way I look at it. When I'm a young lieutenant, I'm at a conference, and I walk up to a British military historian by the name of Barry Pitt. Somebody remember his name. And I happen to mention to him that, gee, I want to teach military history. And he looked at me out of the corner of his eye and said, young man, go out and make some history before you decide to teach it. And then turned around and walked away. Yikes. So I was suitably chastened by that. But the more I thought about it, I realized what he's trying to say is go out and do something, go out and live, go out and be a part of society and learn context before you start to preach in the classroom about what you should do or should not do. I thought that was pretty damn good advice. Let me finish up by saying that I'm getting ready to retire from the Air Force in about 2000. And I'm thinking that what do I want to do, after I grow up? And I decide, well, I want to be Mr. Chips. I want to teach at some university. Wouldn't that be fun, So I sat down with a dear old friend of mine, Denny Showalter, and I said, Denny, give me some advice on this. And I'll never forget Denny's words. He said, Phil, there are two types of military historians. There are the G-ain't it awfuls, and there are the slaughter 'em deads. Phil, you and I are slaughter 'em deads. Universities are hiring G-ain't it awfuls. I took the hint. I went to DC. I became an analyst after I retired. So thank you very, very much. I really appreciate your listening to this, having my wonderful family here. It's just, thank you very much.